Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
Bless God, who has given us the Torah. The Lord God will go before you. Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid, for the Lord thy God will go with you. He will not fail you or forsake you.
Amen.
Throughout countless centuries, the Jewish people have celebrated in the streets of Jerusalem, the holy city, carrying their sacred Torah scrolls, the Jewish Bible that brought monotheism to the Western world. The Judaism of today and the Bible which we know were both formalized in the early centuries of a new millennium, a millennium that saw a world order in dramatic change with the advent of Christianity. Yet precisely this period, which gave foundation to the whole of Western civilization, was a void in the human story, an unrecorded chapter in the history of mankind. The darkness began to lift with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Deep in the underground vaults of the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem lie the remains of the oldest biblical manuscripts in existence, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hidden in desert caves for more than 2,000 years, many of these scrolls are now buried in the vaults of the museum. For almost half a century, they've been seen only by a handful of privileged scholars. Their story has been called the archaeological scandal of the century. For years, leading scholars have waited to see these scrolls, a missing link in the world's history, material that sheds light on the events that shaped Christianity and modern Judaism. For years, publication has been delayed and requests for access have been denied.
This is a room which very few people are allowed into. The reason is because out of the hundreds of scrolls which we have here, a large percentage of them haven't been published or are being published right now. So what we do is that we control the number of people. They have to go through a committee, which is an international committee of scholars, and they are the ones who determine who has access, who doesn't have access, particularly to material which is unpublished.
But the story really begins back in the mists of legend, here in the wilderness of Judea. It was late winter 1947. 3 desert herdsmen made their way along the shores of the Dead Sea. A well-trodden path, their Tamira Bedouin tribe had walked it for centuries. Now its bleak and inhospitable trails gave cover to contraband smugglers. While their animals grazed below, one young shepherd, Muhammad el-Hamid, nicknamed the Wolf, left his companions to climb the craggy hillside of Wadi Qumran, dreaming of the forgotten store of buried treasure he knew one day he'd find. Spotting a cave opening on the steep slope above him, he threw in a large stone and was startled by the sound of breaking pottery. His heart racing, the young Bedouin managed to climb above the opening and hoist himself into the cave. His eyes, adjusting to the half-light, saw rows of mostly broken jars lined up against the wall. Scrambling to the few that remained intact, his hands drew out 3 bundles. Excited beyond belief, he left the cave only to find in his hands 3 old rolls of rotting leather. Frustration blinding him, he failed to see that his eyes were the first in 2,000 years to gaze upon perhaps the most valuable, certainly the most controversial archaeological find of the century, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Obviously, no one knows what's in the unpublished documents except this charmed circle, as they call it, this little club of theirs who has all the cookies.
All scholars have had access to the published text. Many scholars have had access to the unpublished text too.
I don't know. Everything is so secretive. That's the problem with the whole Qumran phenomenon. Everywhere you always ask a simple question. You must find this very surprising. You ask simple questions, and the simpler the question, the less likely you are to get an answer. That's the way it is. I don't know.
Jesus Christ mentions that. He knows about it. There is one mention there in the parable of the unjust God. He speaks about the children of light, which can be only a reference to the Dead Sea sect. This is a hard word.
That this was a kind of Christianity before Christianity. There are theories still around to the effect that this is secret information about Jesus and the apostles.
But all this is nearly half a century away for those 3 Bedouins wandering dejectedly into Bethlehem. In the markets of the town, they learned that the leathers might be worth something after all, if they proved to be antiquities. So, seeking out an agent, it was here at his shop that they first met Khalil Eskandar Shahin, known locally as Kando, a shoemaker and a part-time antique dealer.
And the Bedouin, it's rumored, wanted to use the scroll to repair his sandals. He wanted to make straps, leather straps. And Kando, being a professional, told him that it wouldn't do. I mean, the scrolls are very fragile and they wouldn't make good straps. But on the other hand, they can bring money.
Ahlan wa sahlan, how do you do?
At his house in Bethlehem, Kando wouldn't verify this rumor. In fact, for reasons of his own, he wouldn't even talk to us. But we do know that he agreed to act for the Bedouin for a modest fee. Modest, considering that antiquities trading was strictly black market. The British Mandate authorities in Palestine at that time demanded that all relics be passed on directly to them for an even more modest fee. The Bedouin returned to the desert to rummage the cave for a second time, while Kando cast around for a buyer. Some weeks later, the Bedouin came back with 4 more scrolls. But deciding to hedge their bets, they gave only 1 to Kando and sold the remaining 3 to a second merchant for the kingly sum of 7 Palestinian pounds. Kando, thinking the writing might be ancient Syrian script, brought his 4 scrolls to the Metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, Mar Athanasius Samuel. It was here at St. Mark's Monastery in the Old City that Mar Samuel purchased them, hoping they were early Christian texts.
And Kando sent these books by a person, his servant, called George, to the bishop here. And the bishop at that time, when he got them, was a monk, not bishop.
Summer and autumn passed while Mar Samuel scoured Palestine, Transjordan, and Syria, searching for someone to identify and appraise the value of his scrolls. Samuel wanted desperately to believe them genuine, but met only doubt and skepticism at every turn.
This is the room where Bishop Athanasius Samuel was living as a bishop, and from here he left carrying the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And carrying the Dead Sea Scrolls, he approached the École Biblique in East Jerusalem.
You know, in early days, a lot of scholars just didn't believe this. One of the professors at the École Biblique, who sent the Archbishop packing, saying it was a fake.
The École Biblique, the French Biblical and Archaeological School of Jerusalem, and its director, the archaeologist Father Roland Deveau, are part of the Dominican monastic order. Both play a key role later in the story of the scrolls. Also to play a central role is Catholic convert Professor John Strugnell of Harvard Divinity School. Controversy surrounded him when he led the committee of scroll editors after Father DeVoe. By November 1947, the British Mandate of Palestine was turning sour. Traveling, especially in Jerusalem, was becoming a problem. The United Nations General Assembly was debating the partition of the territory between Israel and Palestine, and with tempers rising on Jewish and Arab sides, the British cordoned Jerusalem into separate zones, barbed wire fences and military passes controlling movement. On November 23rd, Elazar Sukenik, professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, received an urgent phone call from a friend, an Armenian antique dealer from the Old City. He insisted they meet immediately. Without a pass, Professor Sukenik could not travel to the other side of the city. He took his first look at the ancient parchment through barbed wire as he listened to the story of the find. Recognizing the antiquity of the script, he determined to buy the scrolls for the university if he could see the originals. But that meant traveling to Bethlehem, deep in hostile Arab territory. Later that evening, with tensions as high inside the house as on the streets outside, the professor's son Igal came to visit. He listened spellbound to the story. But his father brought him back to earth. Should I dare to go? Yigal Yadin had just come from inspecting the flimsy defense positions around Jerusalem. As operational commander of the Haganah underground forces, he knew better than anyone else just how bad the situation really was. Yadin later wrote in his diary, "As an archaeologist, I felt the opportunity should not be missed. As a soldier, I knew precisely the dangers involved. As a son, I was torn between the two. I told him not to go." Next morning, Sukenik left for Bethlehem. Meeting up with his Armenian friend at the depot in East Jerusalem, they boarded the bus. Sukenik, the only Jewish passenger. Despite the dangers, they completed the transaction and were on their return journey by afternoon. 3 scrolls wrapped inconspicuously in newspaper on Sukenik's lap. He sat quietly throughout the journey, convinced it was destiny that was bringing texts written before the destruction of the last Jewish state 1900 years before back into Jewish hands now, on the eve of the rebirth of the State of Israel. And indeed, that night, the UN voted yes to the partition plan, a yes that meant international agreement to the creation of a free and independent Jewish state. That same night, long-awaited riots broke out. During the months of turmoil that followed, Sukenik and a small team at the Hebrew University began the delicate task of unrolling scrolls stuck together by 20 centuries of decomposition. Slowly, their identity began to appear. The Book of Isaiah, a 24-foot-long scroll, an almost complete manuscript written only 500 years after Isaiah spoke these words. It was almost identical to the Bible we have today. 25 hymns of thanksgiving similar to the Psalms, but in a language all their own. The third manuscript, 19 badly mutilated columns that give a detailed battle plan of a prophetic 40-year war, the war of the children of light against the children of darkness. The final battle, when good triumphs forever over evil. As the contents of the texts became clear, the question arose, who wrote them? Sukenik's thoughts turned to the first-century historian Josephus Flavius, who describes an otherwise unknown Jewish sect, the Essenes.
We think we know what Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes are, and we think our men are Essenes. And we think that Pharisees are the ancestors of current Judaism, and we think that Sadducees lived it up in Jerusalem, wine, women, and song, high priests, and that sort of thing.
When the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus Christ and before, the Jewish world was split. on how to interpret and practice the law, and how to deal with the Romans, and before them the Greeks, whose power held sway over the land. The Sadducees, religiously ultra-conservative temple priests, were the political establishment of the time. They demanded adherence to the letter of the law of Moses, but in everyday life they adopted foreign ways, making them unpopular with the common people. Completing the writing of a Torah scroll is a festive occasion for Jews. One error and the whole scroll is rejected. The scribe's craft is passed from father to son. Thus, the scroll of Isaiah showed that not much had changed from what was written in the time of the Second Temple. Not much in the scroll, but much in Judaism. The rabbinical students in a Jerusalem yeshiva study and discuss different interpretations of the law. Every word, every letter is open to debate. Such debates were just beginning at the time of the Second Temple. This movement, called the Pharisees, shaped Judaism as it appears today. These ultra-Orthodox Jews from the Mea Shearim quarter of Jerusalem are demonstrating against the breaking of the Sabbath laws. They do not recognize the state of Israel and believe that redemption will only come with the appearance of the Messiah. In a way, more than any other modern Jews, they may resemble in their spirit of defiance and self-exclusion the ancient Essene sect. The Essenes, a highly disciplined hierarchical set of mainly celibate men, followed a solar calendar that gave them a Jewish life all their own. A 3-year probation awaited anyone wanting to join the sect. Before the sun rises, they utter not a word on secular affairs, but offer prayers as if beseeching him to appear. This is how Josephus, who himself claims to have been an Essene, describes their life. As Professor Sukenik searched out these references to give substance to what was still an educated guess, Bishop Samuel still searched for an expert to identify his scrolls. In February 1948, Mar Samuel's agent finally approached Sukenik. Meeting here at the YMCA, Sukenik was shown 4 scrolls. As he unrolled the edge of one, these words jumped out to him. The Book of the Community Rule. He shall admit into the covenant of grace all those who have freely devoted themselves to the observance of God's precepts, that they may be joined to the counsel of God. Sukenik immediately offered to buy them. The agent said he'd come back with an answer by phone. The call never came. Sukenik's interest, however, had finally confirmed the scroll's authenticity, and Samuel wasted no time in contacting Azor, the American School of Oriental Research. He hoped the Americans would come up with a better offer. In 1948, John Trevor, acting director of the American School in Jerusalem, unexpectedly came into the possession of what appeared to be a group of ancient manuscripts. Not knowing what they were, he sought to ascertain their authenticity. Trevor made photographs of the scrolls and called Professor W.F. Albright of Johns Hopkins University, America's leading archaeologist and biblical specialist.
And he called him out and he told him the same, that some mysterious scrolls were found. One was opened and it looks like this is a biblical scroll. And the other, he says, is a non-biblical scroll. And we tried to read in it something, but we don't make sense. I told him, tell him to spell each line, each word, and I will put it together.
Albright titled this unknown scroll the Manual of Discipline, a description of the rules, beliefs, and practices of a sect that refers to itself simply as the Community of the New Covenant. And immediately he too connected it to the Essenes.
He called the press and he declared, this is the greatest archaeological discovery ever made.
We have here in the Scroll of Discipline an account of the beliefs and practices of the Essenes.
These texts were revolutionizing the entire field of biblical studies and were setting the academic world on fire.
we're going to know 100 times more about the background in Judaism of the New Testament than we ever dreamed we would.
On May 15th, 1948, attention shifted as the State of Israel was proclaimed and a state of war was declared by all her Arab neighbors. 7 months of war left Jerusalem divided and the Qumran cave in Jordanian hands. As life returned to normal, archaeologists wasted no time in returning to the site. Father Roland Deveau of the École Biblique led an expedition to the cave where the scrolls were found.
Okay, this is one of the jars which was found in the excavations by Father Deveau. It was made specifically for the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can see that, for example, the length of this is about the size of a Dead Sea Scroll. The Dead Sea Scrolls were wrapped in linen. They were then placed in these special jars. Notice that these jars have on the shoulder a locking device. The top then was placed on top of the jar like this, and they then took a cord. They knotted the cord then ran through these lugs here which are on the shoulder, and this was the way in which the scrolls were stored for almost 2,000 years.
Life had returned to normal, but not for everyone. The Bedouin, deprived of their lucrative occupation as smugglers, now turned to archaeology with a gusto. While the excavations went on over the next 4 years, hundreds of manuscripts and tens of thousands of fragments were dug out of more than a dozen caves in and around Qumran.
From then on started a series of excavations, illegal, illicit excavations by the Bedouins and legal excavations by the archaeologists. I'm sorry to say that the Bedouins were always the first.
In order to multiply their profits, the Bedouins started breaking manuscripts into pieces. To prevent this damage, the Jordanian Department of Antiquities set a fixed price for the relics, £1 per square centimeter. So successful was this strategy that a flood of material reached them, down to the tiniest fragments, brought to them in empty cigarette boxes. The vaults of the Rockefeller Museum were full to overflowing, but the budget had run dry.
So they invited other institutions such as McGill, McCormick, other American universities, the Vatican even. They were to buy on the conditions that when the study of the manuscripts was finished, they will be distributed to the various contributors.
The École Biblique was set up in Jerusalem in 1892 as part of a Catholic movement to give priests a scientific basis for their theology. It was natural for them to be deeply involved with the scrolls, and when Father Deveau, the school's director, suggested the formation of an international team to bring the material to publication, it was also natural to invite him to lead it.
Deveau had the foresight to set up the organization of scroll study, bringing in scholars from the various countries and the like. He had the foresight to do this at a time when we didn't yet know how much material was going to come out of the caves.
Here, half a mile below the original cave, lies Khirbet Qumran. On the western shore of the Dead Sea are settled the Essenes, a solitary people, extraordinary beyond all others, who live without women and without money, having only the palm trees for company. These few lines from Pliny the Elder, 1st century Roman geographer and natural historian, are the only reference to the location of the Essene community. The spring of 1953 saw Father Deveau on that same western shore of the Dead Sea at the head of the first extended excavation, a dig that would occupy him for the next 4 springs and lead him to a view of Essene life that would be debated for decades.
This is one of the most interesting archaeological sites in Palestine. It's the first site where we can see the economic background where manuscripts were produced. We have the Essene community and the Essene manuscripts, and we have the Essene bakery and the pottery and everything else.
The 2-month dig unearthed remains of considerable construction. It soon became clear that this was a well-established settlement. The complex consisted of more than 30 buildings, of rough stone blocks and earthen mortar. Some supported wooden second-story rooms above them. From the ruins of one such room, long since collapsed to the ground below, archaeologists reconstructed a table of mud brick and plaster. When inkwells were found, Devoe confidently labeled this room the scriptorium, the room in which the scrolls were written.
I don't think that anything was written at Qumran. You may say that this was, their library was kept there and was hidden there, or in a dire moment other books were brought there to be put in treasury there, to be, the Hebrew word would be an gnizah at Qumran.
Gnizah, from the Hebrew word for hidden, is a burial place for sacred relics. If a Torah scroll or a relic is worn out or damaged, as in this synagogue where fire destroyed the Torah scrolls, they are placed in pots surprisingly similar to those found at Qumran. From here, the funeral procession makes its way to a full burial ceremony. In times of war or persecution, Jews would also hide holy texts in a gnizah. This has led to a belief among some scholars that the works at Qumran are a collection hidden there from advancing Roman troops. The most famous gnizah was found in a synagogue of the Karaite sect in Cairo in 1896. Its greatest enigma was one of the sect's foundation documents, identical to a Qumran scroll called the Damascus document.
A Jewish group of rabbis and apparently Pharisee scholars were forced to leave Judea at that time and go to Damascus, to the north, and then they tell about themselves. This is the Damascus document, the real thing of Damascus document. And then they organized themselves in a community and they established a new covenant, which means a New Testament.
This Karaite cemetery in Jerusalem tells the story of a heretical Jewish sect founded in Persia in the 8th century. Parallels between their documents and practices and those of Qumran generated heated debate in the scholarly community that the Dead Sea Scrolls were medieval from the 8th or 9th century and were one and the same with the Karaite community. When new carbon dating tests showed the manuscripts to be from the turn of the millennium, it became clear that the Karaites had in fact drawn their sources from Qumran, which is an enigma in itself. Theories of an early dating for the texts had already gained ground with the discovery of the unique copper scroll, which some believe was brought from the temple in Jerusalem before its destruction. This is the first time that any ancient scroll was inscribed on metal, let alone on copper, but what was inscribed was a tale of gold, a tale of treasures not yet found. Centuries of oxidation made the copper scrolls too brittle to unroll. They were finally cut open strip by strip. Today housed in a museum in Amman, Jordan, they were recently rephotographed by a team from the Biblical Manuscript Center of Claremont, California.
What it is, I mean, this sounds like something out of, you know, a Walt Disney or Steven Spielberg production, but it's a document that tells you where to find buried treasure. And we're talking the real stuff here, you know, gold, silver, the stuff that would make us all rich.
In the spring of 1953, Professor Sukenik died, and his son, Yigal Yadin, took up his father's research. The following summer, Yadin was lecturing at Johns Hopkins University at Albright's invitation. On June 1st, 1954, an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal captured his attention. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. Realizing these could only be the scrolls in the possession of Mar Samuel, Yadin immediately answered the ad.
Late spring saw the return to Israel of 4 more of the ancient Holy Scrolls, found by shepherds in a cave at the edge of the Dead Sea.
And so Yadin closed the circle opened by his father. The final price, $250,000.
In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Moshe Sharet and his Director General examined the scrolls and announced that the government would build a shrine of the book to house the entire collection, 7 in all, on the campus of the Hebrew University. The unrolling of the 2,000-year-old parchment is a painstaking job. The last of the scrolls is written in ancient Aramaic. The Dead Sea Caves supply a missing chapter to the proud history of the Jews in the Holy Land.
The Shrine of the Book is part of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Its roof, like the lid of the jars the scrolls were buried in. Its gently sloping white opposite the black angular monolith, reflecting the eternal struggle between good and evil. Walking between the two, steps lead down to subterranean chambers where special lighting and controlled humidity preserve the ancient scrolls. The whole museum acts not only as a showcase for the public, but also as a research center open to scholars from around the world, actively promoting publication of all the work on the scrolls. But this was not the case just 2 miles away across the Jordanian border at the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, where hundreds of manuscripts were the private domain of only 8 scholars, the international team.
It was a small group, and it would have been nice to get more people, but we tried, and no one would come. They all thought this was tiny fragments, insignificant, and so we were undermanned.
One of the most fruitful and rewarding finds was Cave 4, just 200 meters from the settlement. 15,000 fragments from more than 500 scrolls were found in this one cave alone. Despite their fragmented and decomposed state, they were assembled and photographed in 1960, and yet most of them still remain unpublished.
Cave 4 is where the problem is. Cave 4 had over 500 different texts. Now, they're all in fragments. But in 35 years, they've published 100 of them.
The international team remained a small group of dedicated scholars. The project, short of funds, most of them would come to Jerusalem only during summer vacations from their full-time teaching positions. They would work on the texts here in the scrollery of the Rockefeller Museum. The manuscripts, pressed between sheets of glass, were for years subject to direct sunlight and changes in temperature, their conditions slowly deteriorating.
The initial team was largely Catholic. They were priests and fathers, abbes, monsignors, and John Strugnell is, of course, himself a convert to Catholicism.
The École Biblique falls under the authority of the Vatican Pontifical Biblical Commission, cardinals and consultants from among the Church's leading scholars. This commission monitors all Catholic spiritual scholarship. In 1955, Father DeVoe became a consultant member of this Vatican Commission, and subsequently all directors of the École Biblique have been members. This led to doubt about the international team's impartiality as scholars, and later to suspicions of a Catholic conspiracy to suppress material unacceptable to the Church.
There are theories still around to the effect that this is secret information about Jesus and the apostles. There was especially strong interest in what may be a valid theory about the connection with John the Baptist and the Essenes.
Not far from Qumran is the monastery of Ein Hajle. These Greek Orthodox pilgrims are making their way down to the Jordan River, to the very spot where John the Baptist is said to have baptized Jesus. This at the very time the Qumran community flourished. As they too practiced ritual immersion, some scholars have drawn the obvious conclusion connecting John the Baptist and the early Christians to the Essenes. Dominating Qumran is an extensive water system so vital in this desert environment. Yet once or twice a year, the rainy season brings flash floods cascading down the Judean mountains into the Dead Sea 4,000 feet below. The community trapped that flow in a natural basin and carried it 700 meters by aqueduct into their settlement. A complex series of channels fed water to all areas of the compound. And it seems they had water in abundance, for from the last cistern there is even an overflow channel onto the terrace below. He will cleanse him of all wicked deeds with a spirit of holiness. Like purifying waters, he will shed upon him the spirit of truth. Thus reads the manual of discipline, the scroll of the community rule. And when his flesh is sprinkled with purifying water and sanctified by cleansing water, it shall be made clean by the humble submission of his soul to all the precepts of God.
It's hard to avoid the fact that early Christianity did put an emphasis on immersion. The Essenes shared their wealth, and the early church was a wealth-sharing group. The early church is governed by a council of 12, and there is a personage called an episcopos.
Like the community in Qumran, the early Christians withdrew to the seclusion of the deserts, to a monastic life of contemplative solitude. These Greek Orthodox monks, like the Essenes, share a communal life deep in the Judean desert. Here they dedicate every action of their lives to the worship of God. For centuries, the monastic ideal was upheld as the way of perfection of Christian life. Righteousness and perfection are also notions central to the writings of Qumran.
The idea that a certain group decided to live monastic life, a cooperative life, it was of very great significance, especially if we remember that this is the first monastic community in the Western world.
Puisse toujours en bénéficier par Jésus le Christ notre Seigneur. Amen.
The scroll of the Messianic rule from Qumran reads, "When they shall gather for the common table, the priest shall bless the first fruits of bread and wine. Thereafter the Messiah of Israel shall extend his hand over the bread, and all the congregation of the community shall utter a blessing."
La seule que je cherche, habiter la maison du Seigneur tous les jours de ma vie.
This is the blueprint for the Last Supper. And the idea of Eucharist come later by the Gospel writers. The idea that you are eating the bread as my body or the wine as my blood.
These similarities between the Essenes and the early Christians caused great excitement in the world. Hundreds of books and articles were written putting forward various arguments. Scholarship mixed with the public imagination to give rise to all kinds of speculation, even to claims that Jesus himself was an Essene.
For instance, Dupont-Sommer was the one who said, actually, the cradle of Christianity should have been not in Bethlehem, but in Qumran. This was too strong for the Christian world to take it. This was too strong also for some scholars to agree to it.
As the results of the excavations interfaced with the contents of the scrolls, DeVoe and the international team began to draw a picture of Qumran, a picture which has become known as the consensus view. This view sees Qumran as a peaceful monastic retreat where the Essenes lived a life removed from the turmoil of the times, times of great social upheaval that gave birth to a new millennium.
We must be very careful of not imposing a monkish structure on Qumran. This is important because some of the earliest people writing on Qumran came from a monastic background and imposed their viewpoint on Qumran studies, and this was accepted. And therefore they saw them living in solitude and copying books all day as if they were a medieval monastery.
The Qumran excavations also uncovered a two-story watchtower by the main gate. With no direct entrance from the ground floor and access possible only from deep within the complex, it suggests that the settlement was a military fort, a nature so strongly reflected in the war scroll of the Essenes. The 1950s and early 60s saw academic debate turn to heated controversy. Who wrote the scrolls? Who lived at Qumran? And what influence, if any, did they have on the birth of Christianity? In 1964, Yigal Yadin excavated the fortress of Masada, just a day's march south of Qumran. Masada, site of the last stand in the Jewish revolt against the Romans. Here, 1,000 Jewish zealots, men, women, and children, committed mass suicide rather than fall into Roman hands. When Yadin unearthed Essene scrolls at Masada, a connection between the Essenes and the zealots was made, which has been disputed ever since. In November 1966, the Jordanian government nationalized the Rockefeller Museum, and the Dead Sea Scrolls became Jordanian property. This act will have repercussions when the museum passes into Israeli hands. In June 1967, the Six-Day War broke out.
Mandelbaum Gate and its vicinity were taken. The next objectives were the Damascus Gate and the Rockefeller Museum.
On the second day of the war, Israeli paratroops fought a bloody battle to take the Rockefeller Museum, used by the Jordanian army for its strong strategic position. After heavy fighting, the museum fell before the Israeli advance.
The Rockefeller Museum, facing the old city. Just 20 yards from here, the old city walls.
The Western Wall was in Jewish hands. So too the treasures of Jewish history, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
There were a few bullet holes in the walls and things like this. There were a few manuscripts that must have been stolen by the individual soldiers when they moved in, but nothing serious.
With fighting still in progress, Yigal Yadin procured a jeep and an army escort and drove down to Bethlehem. For years, he had suspected that another scroll was still in the possession of Kondo, the antique dealer. Faced by Yadin with the Israeli army behind him, Kondo unearthed the shoebox hidden under his kitchen floor. Opening the box, he handed Yadin the longest scroll ever seen, more than 28 feet long. The Temple Scroll, as Yadin named it, proved to be one of the oldest and most important of all the non-biblical Qumran texts.
This part you can still see the lettering, the writing on it. But if we would leave it on the ground a bit longer by the dealer, then it would not be anymore, and great parts of the Temple Scroll would disintegrate totally.
The Temple Scroll was the 8th to come into Israeli hands.
Down goes the flag under Jordanian fire from guns posted all along the walls.
With the annexation of East Jerusalem, a wealth of archaeological treasure came under the responsibility of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. The jewels in the crown of this treasure were the 800 scrolls and thousands of fragments. But when the Israelis went into the basement of the museum, they were shocked to find scrolls disintegrating from lack of preservation facilities.
In this room we have scrolls which are not published yet and on which scholars are working still. I will just show you a few examples of the things that we have here. So this is an example of the scroll, of the fragments which are kept here. This is an example of
This is an example of an unpublished scroll in the way it was kept before 1967, pressed between glass sheets and stuck together in the most primitive way using sellotape.
Just to show you the example, this is the glue and the sellotape with which they were put together. So we decided...
The scholarly community hoped Israel would speed up progress toward publication, but fear of international opinion, a wish to honor agreements, and respect for the years of painstaking work assembling the many tiny fragments led to an Israeli decision to leave the scrolls in the hands of the International Committee.
It was theirs. And even those who died passed it on as if it were an inheritance to a colleague or a student. And then this student or colleague, he had the same rights of possession and exclusion that the man who died had.
Let's say this is quite good, but here you don't have, the connection between the lines. This is too high and this is too low.
In his office at the École Biblique, Professor Father Émile Poesch describes his work, correcting and reassembling the manuscript previously published by Sukenik. Using photographs of the various fragments, Poesch has found a new way to piece them together, using the erosion of the parchment as a clue.
And some are not published. This one is not published, this one is not published, but I found on the negatives.
Piecing together hundreds of fragments into a single scroll is a painstaking job. With biblical scrolls, it's somewhat easier, since the text is known in advance. More problematic are unfamiliar non-biblical scrolls, which must be patched together from numerous fragments of different origin. This requires identifying the scribe's handwriting and the structure of the letter.
We don't have big manuscripts with 100 columns or 50 columns like the Isaiah scroll. We have miserable, beat-up little pieces.
There is one document that has been suppressed for 35 years that the whole scholarly world is talking about. You've probably heard of it. It's called MMT. It's a 120-line letter, and everybody says it's extremely important. The inner circle all have copies, and the outsiders can't look at it.
But somehow, someone got a copy of this MMT document, and a bootleg version was printed.
This is an unpublished Qumran text. It is a text that scholars have known about for at least 5 years. We have been given rumors of it. The editors of the text have talked about it at conferences. They never let us see it. The editor of the Qumran Chronicle, a Polish scholar called Kapera, decided that since everybody was talking about this text, but nobody was able publicly to pretend that they'd actually seen it, he would cut through the hypocrisy and just publish the thing. And this is what he did. He published an unpublished text.
The response of the authorities to the bootleg publication, the first challenge to the monopoly of the International Committee, was immediate and severe. They demanded that Kapera burn all copies or face punishment.
It's a very important text. It was claimed to be a letter from the teacher of righteousness, who, according to many people, is the founder of the Qumran community. The one text, apparently, that we have from his hand. We can actually identify legal traditions belonging to the Sadducees, who were one of the Jewish parties at the time of Jesus, of whom the historian Josephus tells us, but about whom we know very little.
This unpublished text raises so many questions once hoped to be clarified by the Dead Sea Scrolls that rather than an Essene connection, there is now an Essene confusion.
I still believe that the Qumranites were very closely related to the Essenes, but they called themselves Sadducees. In the moments when they weren't whining and womening and singing. This gives more detail and complicates the picture.
So I think what we're dealing with here is a foundation document which gives us a completely new perspective on the origins of the sect and requires us to reevaluate the Essene hypothesis and to ask ourselves whether we don't have here either a proof that they're not Essenes or a need to completely reevaluate the question of who the Essenes are.
But nobody is able at the moment to do what I'm doing with you, and that is to discuss this text and what is in it and what it means. I'm not supposed to be doing this. You realize that?
So why do you do it?
I'm doing it because these texts belong to me as a scholar, and they belong to anybody who's interested in the history of Judaism, and nobody has any right to withhold them.
Because of extended delays in publishing, questions arose as to the motives of the editors. The most extreme claimed a Catholic conspiracy to suppress controversial material connecting the scrolls to early Christianity.
Christianity is never known where the Gospel of John came from. Now, we know that it could have been written at Qumran, almost. If an Essene had been at the crucifixion and then gone down to Qumran, he could have written it.
And for instance, you find a very similar composition to what you find in the Gospel, in the Christian scriptures. And for instance, I have in this beginning of column here, 5, 6, 7, or 8 Beatitudes, like in Matthew.
These words from the leading Catholic scholars must surely lay to rest once and for all any claims of a Catholic conspiracy. But what put Strugnell to rest as the chief editor of the committee was an interview given to Israeli journalist Avi Katzman. Strugnell called Judaism a horrible religion that was originally racist, a Christian heresy that should never have survived.
He definitely holds traditional Catholic views or Catholic Church views with regard to Judaism. That means that Judaism should have been erased from the world, that all Jews should convert to Christianity.
As a convert to Catholicism, he had the convert zeal. He was more Catholic than the Pope. And in many ways, I was told this by people at the École, that his theology is to the right of theirs.
As for me, as a Christian, you know, St. Paul freed us from the yoke of the law.
The Israeli Department of Antiquities, long disturbed by Strugnell's personality, now took action and replaced him with his Israeli co-editor, Emmanuel Tov.
Official publication is this one, which happens to be my own volume, namely...
The reorganization of the whole international team began in earnest, and some 40 new scholars now raced to print. Under mounting international pressure, the Department of Antiquities agreed to open all the material to the scholarly community, but the researchers must sign agreements, pledging not to publish the texts. They can be used only for their own research. Meanwhile, a deadline was set for all the editors to finish their work.
According to the timetable, if I'm not mistaken, we had, it is something like 1996. I would really like to be around in 1999, before the millennium, the turn of the century, and see the scrolls published in full.
One scroll. Okay, this is one scroll, one scroll. Look how many scrolls we have here.
Behind all these difficulties lies the greatest difficulty of all, how to assemble the enormous jigsaw puzzle of tens of thousands of fragments that are the unpublished part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here at the Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California, they believe the answer may lie in computer technology. Together with state-of-the-art companies, they are developing digitally enhanced computer imaging. With photographs of the scrolls in computer databanks, it is possible for artificial intelligence to match fragments to one another in ways impossible for the scholar working only with his hands and eyes.
What we've done is we've made an outline of this piece. You see, there it is, and we rotated it, and now we're taking our outline and we're moving it up where it belongs, so we can put this fragment back where it originally fit. I have done this manually, and it took me about a better part of the day. Now you can take such fragments electronically, and you can move them without moving the text itself. You can move the fragments around like it was a giant jigsaw puzzle. This is revolution. People will not imagine how we ever did it the old way, just like people say, I can't imagine what life was like before word processing or air conditioning, you know? They're going to say the same thing about the way we study ancient texts, especially Dead Sea Scrolls.
While some put their faith in technology, others trust the powers of nature, hoping that the earthquakes which periodically strike the Qumran area will one day open new caves now hidden.
I think I can say there are still scrolls, mostly in collapsed caves, and one day these will come to light. It'll be very exciting.
As you know, every 25 years or so, the Jordan Valley is torn apart by earthquakes. And that's when I expect old closed caves to be opened. And that's when I expect certain manuscripts to come to light again.
I would like some pre-exilic biblical manuscripts. Some old ones. Let's say Jeremiah from the 7th century. How would you like that?
All biblical scrolls discovered so far are almost perfect duplicates of the Bible books as we know them. Here and there, the scribes changed a word or two, and the corrections and erasers on the scroll didn't seem to bother them. One of the most surprising texts is the complete book of Jeremiah, which contains only 17 chapters instead of the accustomed 52. Among the Bible scrolls discovered, some are more prevalent than others. 15 copies of Genesis, for example, 25 of Deuteronomy, 30 of the Psalms. Yet not a single copy of the Scroll of Esther has ever been discovered. Still, some hint at clandestine scrolls in private hands.
There are rumors about a few scrolls still in circulation. It could be true, but I'm very much afraid that the man that spread that rumor is a little imbalanced, so I wouldn't take it very seriously. It should be taken with a grain of salt, of course. I mean, I couldn't deny that a thing like this exists.
We are not unintelligent people, and maybe we are showing foresight about the situation, but that's enough, I think.
You have seen a scroll that nobody knows about?
No, that's the kind of subject I don't want to go into. I mean, if I ever do have access, and it's then I can't talk, then you'll say, well, you talked before, and so it's not the kind of subject to discuss. And this is an underground world. You're talking about the scrolls.
But whatever technology, nature, or the nature of man may prove to hold in store for the future, there is one sure hope for the world at large. Hope that the haze of hostility and the bitter smoke of scandal will clear and let the scrolls of antiquity speak for themselves. Until now, the spirits of truth and falsehood struggle in the hearts of men, and they walk in both wisdom and folly. For God has established the two spirits in equal measure until the renewal, when there shall be no more lies, and all the works of falsehood shall be put to shame.